Clashes in Kashmir. Tensions flare ahead of a court ruling that could see residents lose their special status. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is India's Article 35A. In the coming days, India's top court could decide what the future holds for Kashmir and its citizens. It all hinges on one small part of India's constitution. It's called Article 35A, and it gives long-term residents of Jammu and Kashmir special benefits when it comes to employment, education, and land ownership. But a small NGO, allegedly linked to India's ruling BJP, has been pushing for the law to be abolished. They call its preferential treatment unconstitutional. But many Kashmiris fear that if the law is scrapped, the territory could be overrun by outsiders and change the Muslim-majority demographics. For more, here's Shoaib Hassan.
It's the latest flashpoint in one of the most complicated conflicts in the world. India's Hindu nationalist BJP government says it wants to amend the legal status of Kashmir. The Himalayan region was divided into India and Pakistan-administered territories after the two countries fought a war that ended in 1948. India-administered Kashmir formally joined the Indian Federation in 1950, with special privileges defined soon after under Article 35A of the Constitution. These include allowing only people born in Kashmir or of direct Kashmiri descent to have the right to reside in the territory permanently and to own land. Article 35A has been maintained by the Indian state, despite calls by hardline groups for it to end following the start of the Kashmir insurgency in 1986. But the ruling BJP calls 35A unconstitutional and says it should be abolished. The party has now filed a petition in India's Supreme Court challenging the law. Kashmiri leaders say repealing the law will only complicate the region's problems and have compared it to the introduction of Israeli settlements on Palestinian lands.
The whole of Kashmir has a unified voice, whether it is elderly, youth, ladies or children. And we will protect the state subject law with our lives.
It's seen as the latest effort by Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government to try and bring the violence under control. The BJP already imposed direct federal rule under a governor after the UN released a report listing human rights violations by security forces.
It is essential that the Indian authorities take immediate and effective steps to avoid a repetition of the numerous examples of excessive use of force by security forces in Kashmir.
Modi's government dismissed the report, calling it an interference in India's internal affairs. Will the latest move lead to a further breakdown in law and order? Will Article 35A be repealed? And, if so, what will it mean for the deteriorating relationship between New Delhi and the Kashmiris? Shoaib Hassan, The Newsmakers.
Well, to debate this further, I'm joined now from New Delhi by Sudhanshu Mittal. He is a senior member of India's ruling BJP. And in Washington, D.C., we have Salman Anisoz. He is a member of the opposition Indian National Congress. Thanks both so much for joining us. I need to start by getting each of your opinions really on Article 35A that gives this special status to Jammu and Kashmir. Salman, let me ask you first. Is it time to scrap it and see Jammu and Kashmir subject to the same status as other Indian states?
Well, absolutely not. This abrogating this article is simply not possible because this is the legal basis by which citizenship rights were extended to the people of Jammu and Kashmir in 1954. This was the Delhi Agreement of 1952 predated this proclamation. Without this, you don't really have citizenship rights for the people of Jammu and Kashmir. The entire legal edifice that has been created so that Jammu and Kashmir could become an integral part of India would basically be demolished. So I think the BJP and their parent body, the RSS, They have a very unitary kind of framework which they use for India. They think of India just in this, there's this one vision for India, and everybody has to comply with that. And I think what is remarkable about India is its great diversity. And I think that is what the Constitution is about, and that is what must be respected. I think they're playing with fire for petty politics, and I think everybody can see through it. And I'm pretty confident the Supreme Court is going to reject this bid.
Okay. Sudhanshu Mittal, I assume you're not on the same page.
Mr. Salman doesn't seem to have articulated the issue which is before the court. The issue before the court is 35A, which was incorporated in the Constitution, whether it was validly incorporated or not. You see, Indian Constitution has a provision called Article 368, which outlines as to how the Constitution can be amended. It says it can only be amended by the Parliament itself on a two-third majority in both the houses. Now, this Article 365, Article 35A was incorporated through a presidential order, which was passed on 14th May 1954. And it is this which is being questioned, whether the president had the authority to pass an order which amends the Constitution, because Constitution itself provides as to how the Constitution has to be amended. So this is a core issue. Mr. Salman is so obsessed with his own analogy that he will never argue the legality of it. And secondly, see, 35A only empowers the assembly of the Jammu and Kashmir to determine who will be a permanent resident of Jammu and Kashmir. 370 is where the entire power flows, and 370 mandate was incorporated in the Constitution, and the Constitution came into being in 1949, effective on 26 January 1950. So I would rather prefer that Mr. Salman brushes his knowledge of constitutional law as well as history before making such wild allegations about our intent. See, your intent has been dubious till now, Mr. Soz. You have taken a stand differently in Jammu and Kashmir and differently in New Delhi. So, I mean, let's debate the issue instead of calling each other names, because I don't think it is name calling that we are debating today. Okay. I have presented the legality of the proposition. Please answer the legality of the proposition.
Go ahead, Salman. Let's get your response.
I think, it's laughable. First of all, in 1961, the Supreme Court already weighed in on this idea of bringing in this Article 35A by presidential proclamation. Mr. Mittal should actually do some read up on history. I think what the BJP and the RSS are great at is trying to revise history, and I think that is what is common to all nationalist movements around the world, or not just nationalists. These are kind of right-wing nationalist movements, populist movements. That's what they're trying to do. That is a fundamental thing. I mean, he can say whatever he wants. That's what lies at the heart of this. Now, this special provisions for Jammu and Kashmir are not just for Jammu and Kashmir. There are special provisions of different nature, including of domicile, for other states. Mizoram is there, Nagaland is there, Himachal Pradesh is there. Why is it that the BJP, which is ruling Himachal Pradesh, why does it not go for similar things out there? Because they have a very communal agenda. Their bigotry is well known, and I think that is what bothers them. Now, if the Supreme Court has weighed in on how this was done, this was a historic compromise. You don't go back and completely change what happened when the founders of this country and the people of Jammu and Kashmir came together. And this was a way to assign citizenship rights. Now, they want to take those citizenship rights away. The BJP is essentially participating in an anti-national activity. They are actually, this is a direct assault on India itself, and they know it, but they're playing with fire. That is why I said they're playing with fire. This is the same party, by the way. They're very hypocritical people. You have to understand. The people who are watching this television show around the world. No, please let me finish. The people who are watching the show around the world should know one thing about these kinds of supremacist majoritarian parties. I mean, think about the hypocrisy. They fight beef politics in India. Eating beef is not okay in the rest of the country, but eating beef is okay in some parts of the country where they need the votes. Is that true or not? Mr. Mittal cannot disagree with that. So
you are
fundamentally,
lying.
this is the legal. This is the Article
Mr.
35.
Soos, we are on an
I don't want to be
international
interrupted.
channel.
I don't want to.
Can I?
Mr.
Now, can
Mittal,
I
this
do-
is
you did
not
put a
your
question
regular
to him,
Times
though,
Now
Salman.
or Republic TV. This is not your paid channel. This is an international channel. You must respect.
Miss,
You
can
must
I
respect
intervene?
other people.
You did
Do
pose
not
a question
interrupt
to
me.
him, though.
Do not interrupt me.
You did pose a question to him, though, to be fair, Salman. But don't worry, we will
Sure.
come back to you. Sudhanshu, do respond.
Mr. Soos, before calling somebody anti-national, I think you ought to be responsible, because if anybody has shown anti-national traits, it's you, your family, and your party.
There you go.
Please, we are debating a legal issue. Do not use that word, because I take serious offense to that. We are debating a legal issue. Let's talk about it. You said 1961 order. Which order, Mr. Soos? I have come prepared with all the orders. You have not shown me any order of 1961. Mere verbosity and false claims do not make your claim right. Now, let me read out the preamble of the Constitution of Jammu and Kashmir, which was adopted on the 17th November 1956, of which all your leaders were signatories. What did it say? Preamble to the Constitution of Jammu and Kashmir is quoted as under. We, the people of state of Jammu and Kashmir, having solemnly resolved in persons of the accession of state
Sudhanshu?
of India, which took place. Yeah.
I just
Can
need
I
to
finish?
interrupt here because you can say
Yeah,
say as much as you want that this is about a legal issue, and you can argue your point.
That's
but
what-
the bottom line is the majority Muslim population in Kashmir does not believe you. They don't feel this is a legal
No,
question for you. They feel this is about you bringing a Hindu population into a Muslim majority area. How do you combat
Yeah.
that?
Can you imagine that this issue is not being enforced by us? It is the Supreme Court of India, under which jurisdiction we all subject ourselves to, which has to decide the legality of the issue. Where is the government bringing in any legislation to enforce anything of this kind which is being propagated? We have done nothing. The Supreme Court is looking at the legality of the order of 35A. If it holds it to be legal, so be it. If it does not hold to be legal, so be it. Now, Mr. Soos also talked about beef eating. Does Mr. Soos know that it is his party which had created laws in all the states where it thought beef eating should be banned? It is not BJP. It's your party, Mr. Soos, which created a legislation in UP, in Madhya Pradesh, in Haryana, in Himachal,
Okay.
in all the states, barring Kerala. You are the hypocrites. For then appeasing the Hindus, you were the ones who made the law. We never made the law.
Okay,
and now
Salman.
you're questioning us. You are the ones who decided Kerala would be exempted. You are the one who decided Arunachal will not have it. You are the one who decided West Bengal will not
Salman,
have it.
let
And now
me
you
let
want to blame
Salman
us.
respond because
Have
I
you
don't want to
bringing-
make
have
these
you brought in
attacks
any
as
legislation?
personal as they seem to be getting. Salman, let me ask you, I mean, this is, as Sudhanshu is arguing, this is just an issue for the Supreme Court to decide on its legality. Is that fair for the BJP to say?
Look, this is not just a legal issue, this is a political issue. Kashmir, as we know, has been a long-standing political issue. The state of Jammu and Kashmir was brought in to the Indian Union as a result of a lot of negotiations at that time. Mr. Mittal and the BJP and the RSS, which is their parent body, may not know much about that time because they did not participate in India's freedom struggle. But those who did were from the Congress party, and that is why the constitution came up the way it did, and the compromises that had to be made at that time with different groups of people. That was part of the historic nature of those times, and that is where the Congress party and others were working. And these guys were absent, and now they can say whatever they want, but they were basically absent from the freedom struggle. Now, so it was a political issue. Now they're trying to kind of circumvent a political issue by going with a legal argument. And I'm telling you that in the Lakhanpal case, Mr. Mittal, do read up on it, this presidential proclamation issue has been discussed. Let the Supreme Court come up on, let the Supreme Court kind of come up with a judgment on this as well. But let me tell you that the BJP and the RSS are playing with fire, not just on this issue. On a multitude of issues, they've created a lot of disharmony in India. Every day you will see reports, not just in the Indian media, but also around the world about what is happening in India. there is this totalitarianism
We are discussing
that is,
35A.
entering our discourse.
We are discussing 35A. We are not into a
think,
political dialogue here.
yes, 35. No, but you see, that is the thing. People of the world and people of India need to understand. You see, Mr. Mittal, with all due respect, you cannot speak over me. This is not Times Now. This is not Republic TV. These are not your paid channels. These are not your paid channels.
Republic
We
TVs
have
where
a
you can
respectful
lie with
debate.
impunity.
Please listen, and then you can make your point.
35A.
Everybody is watching. This is not Republic TV. I'm telling you, this is not your paid channel.
Sudhanshu Mittal, I do have to ask you this, though, because many people are asking,
that is what,
not just
because people don't
Salman in
know.
this
People have to be
case.
told.
Not just Salman is raising
Sorry,
this issue, that many Indians are questioning the timing of these efforts, the timing being very poor,
Absolutely.
because there has been so many protests and so much strife in the region. Why do this now? Why risk creating further potential violent conflict in Kashmir? Why is it so necessary at this time?
What is a matter of Supreme Court's jurisdiction is not something which the government decides or the BJP decides. It is the Supreme Court which decides what litigation is it supposed to undertake and what it is not supposed to undertake. Now, to say now Supreme Court, he may not be believing in the majesty of law or the majesty of Supreme Court, but as a citizen who respects the institutions of India,
the Supreme Court decides on the litigation that's brought before it. At whatever time it is brought before. You've brought this to the Supreme Court now.
No, we never. No, please understand, we are not, neither government of India or BJP is a petitioner in this. So to blame us, I mean, it is so preposterous. Now it's a pack of lies which are just tried to be perpetrated here. Let me just tell Mr. Soz something more which he may not be able to know. You refer to Khetrapal's case. It does not give a judgment on 35A, sir. So don't lie. The world is watching. And if a senior leader of Congress is to lie with impunity, then it's tragic. Instead of winning an argument on the basis of your argument, you want to propound a falsehood, which is least expected out of you. Your father has been a cabinet minister. You have been a very prominent political family. Let's concentrate on the legality. Supreme Court is well within its right to decide whether 35A is a valid legislation or not a valid proclamation order. If it decides it is not, it is not. If it decides that yes, 35A is valid, that's the end of the story. BJP government or BJP party is neither a petitioner nor anything to do with it.
Okay.
Yes,
let me get a quick response from Salman. We just have a few minutes left. Salman, quick response there.
Look, Mr. Mittal may say many nice things about me or my father, but that is besides the point. You know, I thank him for that. But the important thing is this. Everybody knows it's an open secret that those who have gone to the Supreme Court have gone at the behest of the RSS and the BJP. This is not a secret at all in the country. Okay, everybody knows. So what they're doing is this is basically linked to their election strategy. They want to demonize Kashmiris. They want to say we're going to do this. We're going to get rid of Article 370. We're going to get rid of Article 35A. We're going to change the demography of the state. They basically want deep political unrest so that they can convince some people to vote for them in this election. Kashmir is one of their pieces, these pillars of a re-election campaign that, frankly, has gone pretty bad for them because in the last 1 year, the graph of the BJP has fallen around the country. So now, in desperation, they'll be looking for all sorts of things. This is one of those things. Nobody can say that this is not a political matter. In fact, the former chief minister, Mehbooba Mufti, who was just their ally, they were in government together until just a couple of months back, she says that if Article 35A is scrapped, there will be nobody to carry the Indian flag in Kashmir. That's what she said. Ask them, how do they ally with such people then? The former Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, Umar Abdullah, has basically come out and said that mainstream politics will be finished out there in J&K. This is what they're playing with. The people who went to the Supreme Court went because of them. They're the instigators. They're the instigators of not just the Kashmir problem right now, the problems in Kashmir right now, but so many problems from mob lynchings to nationalism. They're basically no different than the white nationalists of America. I can tell you, I'm in Washington, no different than the white nationalists of America.
Sudhanshu Mittal, final
And
words.
for 16
forget
years,
60 years. Yeah.
And for 16 years, Mr. Sose's party was ruling the center as well as ruling in Kashmir. And Mr. Sose's party was also in alliance with Mehbooba Mufti and also with NC. So you do the crimes and you want to blame us for that? Please go ahead and do it. I mean, there must be an iota of integrity which Mr. Sose and his party must have. You are the criminals. You are the ones who perpetrated. And you talked about Article 370. Sir, 370's starting line is temporary provision with respect to state of Jammu and Kashmir. 370 was never a permanent statute. It was a temporary statute. As per the
Cannot be
Constitution, you may
abrogated.
not have read it.
Sorry,
You may not have
cannot be
read it. I have
abrogated.
read it. And I have read it all my life. So, Mr. Sose, I thought you were an educated man.
I'm a Kashmiri. I know everything about Article 370. Please don't teach me about Kashmir.
I never thought. Now,
Mr. Mittal, do not teach me about Kashmir. I'm a Kashmiri. So do not teach me about Kashmir. I know much more than you do.
And Sudhanshu
Now you are
Mittal,
interrupting.
I'm
Is
going to
this
have to
your paid
interrupt
channel?
you.
Is this your paid
We are
channel, sir?
completely out of time. In fact, we're over
So,
time
we are
for
well
this
within our
segment
rights
of
to
the
say Supreme
program.
Court must decide.
I think we'll check in with both of you as soon as we hear further details on what a potential ruling could entail. I'd like to thank you both so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come on the Newsmakers, help is on the way. The UN Security Council eases aid access to North Korea, but can the Hermit Kingdom be trusted to use it honestly? And why do many South Koreans want refugees from Yemen thrown out of their country? Well, North Korea is one of the most heavily sanctioned nations in the world. And while exact figures are hard to come by, poverty is widespread and its people are in desperate need of help. Now, that help could be on its way after the UN Security Council agreed to make it easier for humanitarian aid to be delivered to the Hermit Kingdom. The guidelines were drawn up by the United States, which at one stage was the most hostile nation on the Security Council toward Pyongyang. But a summit earlier this year seems to have eased the tension. So, is this a turning point for North Korea, and can Kim Jong-un be trusted? Sandra Gatman reports.
North Korea is one of the planet's most isolated nations. It's run by a militarized communist regime and heavily sanctioned by the rest of the world. Food is scarce, agricultural production is weak, and more than 10 million people are undernourished. When given access, the international community has sent humanitarian help. But there's long been concern about propping up a government that skeptics say is more concerned with flexing its military muscle than feeding its people. Lately, funding to North Korea has dried up. The UN's World Food Program says North Korea needs $50 million a year in aid, but the agency has only received $15 million in donations from member countries. It's not clear what exactly caused the shortfall, but some experts say North Korea's nuclear activity and sanctions against the country have complicated the aid process. The UN Security Council has now agreed on new guidelines, which one UN official says will provide clarity on delivering humanitarian aid to the North Korean people without violating sanctions. But the World Food Program says North Korea also has a part to play, like giving donors more access to information about where the aid is going.
It is absolutely important that if you want donor countries to step up and help, you've got to be able to respond to the data we need, because they've got to make decisions where their dollar is most effective.
Despite signs of a possible rapprochement between US President Donald Trump and North Korea's Kim Jong-un, deep mistrust is still the biggest barrier to progress. US intelligence officials believe North Korea has continued its missile program despite an agreement to denuclearize the peninsula. But Pyongyang says it's keeping its end of the deal, including the dismantling of nuclear testing tunnels and handing over the remains of US soldiers killed during the Korean War. At the Security Council, It was the U.S. who recommended the guidelines to make it easier to send aid into North Korea. Could it be the gesture Pyongyang was waiting for? And will it be enough to get help to millions of desperate people? Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
And to discuss this further, I'm joined now from Augusta, Georgia, by Han Park. He is the founding director of the Center for the Study of Global Issues. In Washington, we have Sung-Yoon Lee. He is a professor in Korean Studies at Tufts University. And completing our panel, Olivia Enos. She is a policy analyst with the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks all so much for joining us. Sung-Yoon Lee, let me begin with you. And first, if you can, help us understand how serious the need in North Korea really is. I mean, the World Health Organization has said malnutrition is rife. Some 40% of North Koreans are undernourished. But do we really know the situation on the ground?
We have a good idea because North Korea suffered a devastating famine in the mid to late 1990s, and various international NGOs, organizations like Oxfam and Doctors Without Borders, operated in North Korea under severe constraints, rules set by the North Korean government, and then grew frustrated and they left. And the UN has been monitoring the food insecurity situation in North Korea ever since then, now more than 20 years ago. One of the most amazing feats about North Korea, which is in so many ways weird and unique, is that North Korea is the only industrialized, literate economy in the world to have suffered a famine and endures this kind of serious food shortage situation each year. You mentioned that by one metric, by the UN, 40%, over 42% of North Koreans today are suffering from malnutrition, malnourishment, which is the term used. Now, when you go down that list of all other nations in the top 10, if you will, North Korea stands out as the only literate, industrialized, urbanized economy. All other nations on that top 10 or top 20 even list have serious problems like high adult illiteracy, as high as 80% of the adult population. Those are immiserated economies, often beset by internal problems. But North Korea is different. It already outpaced South Korea in terms of industrial output now more than 50 years ago in the mid-60s. Yet every year the North Korean people remain hungry. There has to be a logical reason for that situation.
But you believe humanitarian aid is needed and should be delivered, correct?
Absolutely. And oftentimes people have the misperception that UN resolutions purportedly penalizing the North Korean government and U.S. sanctions against North Korea inhibit the delivery or even prohibit the delivery of food aid and medical supplies and medicine. That is simply not true. In every UN sanctions legislation or executive order, there is an exemption clause. No one wants the suffering of the North Korean people to continue. But under the rules set by the North Korean government, which does not allow basic universal code of conduct like outside monitoring, advance notice and monitoring of where the food and medicine end up, it is very hard to help the North Korean people.
Okay. Han Park, I can see you disagreed with some points there. I'll let you go ahead.
Yes, you can spit out all these numbers. But I personally witnessed, I visited North Korea many times, most recent just 2 years ago. The food shortage is real, and medical supply is a very short supply. And the United Nations sanctions, American sanctions, in the form of food and medical supply is really felt there. And the North Koreans think that America is using food and medical supplies as weapons. I think that's such a very devastating condemnation of the United States. We want to make sure that we're not doing just that. And North Korea is very poor in terms of basic needs because North Korea has been isolated from the rest of the world for many years. North Koreans do not believe. They failed feeding their people. In fact, they increased domestic crop production quite a bit in the last few years.
Okay.
But external especially from China and South Korea, unable to send food and humanitarian aid. It's a real serious problem.
Okay, let me get to Olivia. I'd like to bring her into the debate here because it's interesting to hear Han Park say that the United States is using food and medicine as a weapon when others have said that it's actually the North Korean regime that uses food as a weapon.
North Korea loves to hate on the U.S., and the reality is that if they can blame the sanctions for the serious human rights violations that are occurring there, they will. But the reality is that North Korea has diverted funding and resources to the tune of billions of dollars for its missile and nuclear weapons program in the same year that it requested a mere $111 million in food assistance from the World Food Program. I absolutely support assistance getting to the average North Korean, but the reality is that the Kim regime and the command economy that they operate is the primary reason why people continue to suffer in North Korea today. I think that the U.S. would be wise to point out, in fact, that the institution of sanctions has actually resulted in a correlation and increase in the informal markets in North Korea, where individuals actually have greater access to the market economy, which is today providing more of the food and resources than North Korea's command economy can or ever will. So I think we should be using this as an opportunity to highlight the serious human rights abuses that the Kim regime continues to mete out and carry out against its people.
Sun Yun Lee, let me ask you this. I mean, one of the greater fears among many of the NGOs and aid organizations is that aid delivered for humanitarian purposes to help those suffering, that you all agree do need help, actually backfires and helps to empower the people who cause the suffering of the poorest. Because it's almost impossible to know exactly what is being done with the aid that's delivered on the ground, even when it is delivered in the hard form of actual food currency. There had been reports that food aid was not being delivered to civilians, but instead to members of the military who were then selling it on the black market for a profit. So how much is that fear of this aid, even food, solid food, the fear of that aid being misdelivered among NGOs? And how much of a problem is it really in empowering the already corrupt regime?
Professor Han said, I'm spitting out numbers. Let me spit out some more UN numbers for our viewers. As you said, North Korea sells food, international food aid on the black market and to third countries. World Food Program food, sacks of rice have been found resold in Thailand during the famine, for example. Many people used to have the notion that the North Korean famine was the result of poor management, poor soil management, a bit of incompetence, and a heavy dose of US sanctions, and even climate change, the most ardent defenders of North Korea say today. Although it's amazing to me how climate change, without fail, each year stops right at the border with China and with South Korea. No one's starving in those two countries. During the height of the famine, at the height of the famine, according to the US State Department, North Korea's defense budget was $7 billion. During the height of the famine, North Korea sold Kim Jong-il, the father of the current leader. He purchased over $1.5 billion worth of outdated Soviet MiGs, warplanes from Kazakhstan and Ukraine. He spent $800 million building the world's most extravagant mausoleum for his father, who died in 1994. To put some of these figures in perspective, had North Korea spent about $100 million, at most $200 million, with which to buy food, import food, not a single North Korean man, woman, or child would have died during those lean years in the mid to late 1990s. Today, of course, North Korea, according to a landmark UN study published on February 17, 2014, North Korea is guilty at the state level of, quote, deliberate mass starvation, the crime of, quote, knowingly causing prolonged starvation, and North Korea spends anywhere between $600 to $700 million a year on the import of so-called luxury goods. So it's not that North Korea doesn't have the money with which to import food, but the perverse priorities of the regime prevent that very sensible action.
Okay, Han Park, I'll let you reply.
Yes. Real question is, what do we want North Korea to become? A market-oriented capitalist economy and capitalist system? It will never change in that direction. Now, when we have a food aid, a medical aid, they are marketing in black market, all speculations. There may be some numbers, but many people are speculating. And what really happens on the ground is, in fact, the food shipped in the direction of military organizations. That is viewed very carefully by the people. So the people will be critical of the military. Even in that country, people's opinion about their system, about the military matters. North Korea, yes, is a dictatorship and everything else, but people's opinion matters. In that sense, North Korea is people's democracy, like is China. So I think we cannot expect North Korea to become a capitalist system, but we want North Korea to be a civilized system in the world. In the world, there is no country that will compromise security situation for food, for economic gains.
Okay.
Always security is considered more important in North Korea as well as everyone, including the United States.
I mean, there is this issue I've heard many Koreans bring up of, under the guise of songbun, this tradition that says it's your family's history that determines what you get, even insofar as how much nutrition you get, what's delivered to you from the government.
I think that one of the more interesting things that's going on when North Korea looks at the different types of assistance that it receives, because it's not just food aid, there's also different types of medical assistance that's often given, and there's a whole host of different types of assistance that they receive. But what's interesting is if you watch North Korea's behavior over the last year or so, they've actually rejected certain forms of aid, the type of aid that would go directly to the people. An example of this was the Eugene Bell Foundation was planning to provide tuberculosis vaccination, something they've been doing for years, something that benefits individual North Koreans, where we can guarantee that the aid is given directly to the benefit of a North Korean person, not the North Korean regime. But Kim Jong-un, this is just another example of his brutality, began to refuse the receipt of those tuberculosis vaccinations. And I think that you see that they are willing to receive these types of aid, like the food aid, that we can't always guarantee actually gets to the people. And as you say, is based off of the poor songbun or the good songbun as to whether or not they might receive this. But instead, they take the aid that they can then use for their own benefit. The reality is that U.S. policymakers and aid organizations need to prioritize the type of aid that can go directly where it is most needed, to the North Korean people who are in need. And contrary to what my co-panelist said, I believe that the institution of sanctions, if you look at the history and the trajectory of growth in markets, which I think all of my panelists agree is a positive development in North Korea, all of that has taken place simultaneous with and growing in the midst of institution of sanctions. I think there's actually a positive relationship between the two, because the people have to resort to the markets, a free market where they can get information and access to food and life-saving goods that they absolutely need.
Okay, Han Park, go ahead. And do actually as well respond to the question that Olivia had taken about the North Korean regime using the tradition of songbun to use food to reward the loyalists.
Yes, North Korea is not, yes, that leadership is dictatorship, but it's not the kind of third world dictator, brutal dictatorship with military might. It's not that kind of system. It is very culturally brainwashed, if you will, in paternalistic socialism that its entire country is like a family, from his grandfather, father, now himself. A family with 23 million people. The family ethics is so important there. You're not going to have a Kim Jong-un, his father, grandfather, smuggling out monies abroad, overseas banks, things like that. So it is so important for them to maintain a posture of benevolent parent. So that is paternalistic democracy. Unless you realize that, you cannot understand.
Okay.
So these collective groups are competing for more sales, more bringing in more money. It's not really proliferation of market economy, market activities whatsoever.
Okay. Han Park, I will have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we are completely out of time for this segment of this program. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. Now, while North Korea might be on the verge of getting assistance, it seems some in South Korea aren't too keen on providing for others in need. Just over 500 Yemenis fleeing war have landed on South Korea's resort island of Jeju. The new arrivals triggered a wave of anti-refugee sentiment, with protests and petitions calling for the country to further tighten its already tough immigration laws.
We want to go home, but not with this situation. We want from the Korean government and the Korean people, they accept us and they deal with us as people. They need some things. We are looking for help.
그 주변에 나라도 많은데 굳이 제주도까지 올 필요가 있어요.
예를 들어보면 캐나다 같은 경우는
난민이 차별받고 보호받지 못하는 나라에서 그 나라 국민들의 인권을 보호받을 수 있을까 하는 생각이 들어요. 난민에 대해서 잘 대우하는 정부라면 자국민의 인권도 마땅히 생각하는 그런 정부라고 생각합니다.
Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined now by Robert Kelly. He is a political science professor at Pusan National University. Thanks so much for speaking to us. As someone who has lived and worked in South Korea for so many years now, help us better understand the mentality here. It's only 550 people who've arrived, yet hundreds of thousands of South Koreans have signed a petition to protest their staying in the country. Why this seemingly hysterical reaction?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are actually pretty surprised at just how sort of over the top it's been for just so few people. I have to say I'm actually pretty shocked myself. I've lived here for 10 years as a foreigner, and I would have thought that Koreans would respond a little bit better, to be perfectly honest. You know, Koreans themselves were refugees after the war. In the early 1950s, a lot of Koreans fled the country. There was a lot of international aid to South Korea to get it back on its feet, even to North Korea, actually. After the war, you would have thought that South Koreans would behave a little bit better. But you know, I mean, that South Korea is not really accustomed to immigration. South Korea doesn't have a Muslim population of any sizable real size. You know, it's not really accustomed to taking in refugees. It sees these people as from some conflict very far away, for which South Korea is really not responsible at all. And it has no real responsibility to take them in. The Japanese talk the same way about refugees from the Middle East too, right? That why should we take them in when it was caused by the Europeans and the Arabs and things like that. So, I mean, that's kind of the response. It's right. I wouldn't say it's satisfactory, but that's the response.
And it seems in South Korea as well, some of them don't actually believe these asylum seekers are from an actual conflict area. Is there a lack of education here, really?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's certainly true, right? I mean, I see that all the time when I teach. I mean, Korean students just don't learn a lot about the Middle East. That's just not Yeah, it's just not high in the agenda here. I mean, South Korea's politics, South Korea's external politics are really dominated by 5 countries: the United States, North Korea, Japan, China, and Russia. And that's really what Koreans spend a lot of their time learning. When Koreans learn foreign languages, they almost always tend to learn English. And then after that, it's maybe Chinese and maybe a European language or something like that. Korea doesn't really have Middle East experts. It's a small country. There's only 53 million of them, right? And Korea is really not deeply vested in the Middle East in any meaningful way, other than some basic import and export stuff, selling refrigerators for oil, that kind of stuff. But South Koreans don't really participate in the Middle East, and all of a sudden it's just sort of like washed up on their shores. And it has activated a lot of latent racism. I mean, racism and xenophobia are problems in Korea going back for a long time. Any foreigner who's lived here in Korea can tell you that. It's not a particularly open place, I think, particularly for dark-skinned foreigners, I think, to be perfectly blunt. And that's, I think, what you're seeing here.
And Professor, I mean, the government has to issue a response now because more than 200,000 people signed this petition. What do you think the government actually should say, and what do you expect them to say?
Yeah, I believe the government actually has. I believe the Prime Minister responded. I'm not entirely sure. I'll have to check that. But the response has basically been that, yes, South Korea has a responsibility to refugees because it did sign the UN Convention on that, right? Which is sort of a pro forma thing. It's very, very difficult for people to get to Korea because they have to fly in, right? South Korea is essentially an island because of the demilitarized zone, so it's very hard to get entry here. It ascribed to the sort of pro forma requirement, but beyond that, there's been a lot of sort of caving, quite honestly, to nationalist and racist opinion, right? We're going to check and see if they're fake refugees, which is sort of pretty ridiculous if you think about it, right? I mean, these are people from Yemen, arguably the worst civil war on the planet. I mean, suggesting they're fake refugees borders on racism, I would argue. There's going to be sort of crackdowns to make sure they're not criminals. There's going to be background checks. I mean, in some ways, it's sort of taking their cues from Donald Trump, right? I mean, Donald Trump, I think, has legitimized this kind of rhetoric. I mean, people just didn't talk this way 5 years ago about refugees, but here we are.
Right. I mean, there is a lot of irony here because, as you said, the Koreans themselves had the experience of being refugees as well during the Korean War. They face so much discrimination, for example, in Japan, where they can't actually, so many of them fight for generations just to become actual citizens of Japan, when it's really the only country they've lived in. And now here you see them, in a sense, dishing it out to others. And another issue as well is, like so many developed nations, including Japan at the top of the list, South Korea faces an exceedingly low birth rate, which many see immigration as the only real solution to. Would South Koreans not accept immigration as part of the solution to their low birth rate problem?
Yeah, that's actually sort of a really big growing debate. I mean, this is something I've said in my own writing repeatedly. I teach this stuff. I mean, Korea's birth rate is now below 1 live birth per female, which is just staggeringly low, right? I mean, Korea is a rapidly aging society. By like 2050, that over 65 population is going to be something like 25%. I mean, it's really, really fast. And so, yeah, at some point, Korea is going to have to take immigration. The Korean government, in my opinion, has been dragging its feet on this question, actually. I mean, when I came to Korea 10 years ago, people were talking about this and stuff, and people are still talking about it, and the government hasn't really moved on it. The government is though, responding to public opinion, right? I mean, the Koreans are just not keen on immigration. They're just not. There's a lot of racism here. There's a lot of anxiety that foreigners come and they bring crime and they spread venereal diseases and things like that, and they're here to sort of, take Koreans and sort of do all kinds of terrible things with them. Foreign characters are sort of often like bad guys in Korean movies and television dramas and stuff like that. I mean, it's just not, Korea's just not as open as I think, a lot of like Western states are. And I mean, I think they're getting there. It's a lot better than when I came here, right? But they haven't, I don't think there's been enough of a national debate on immigration in Korea and the need for an improving labor force and expanding labor force. But when they do get to immigration, it's probably going to be people from Southeast Asia rather than people from the Gulf. And that's a pretty big bridge to cross for the Koreans. Okay.
But I mean, I think in that respect, they'd also be thinking about much bigger waves of immigration. Let's go back to the only 550 Yemenis that are currently applying for asylum in South Korea. And I bring up the education issue again because, as you've mentioned, they have this distorted image of what immigrants, particularly from the Middle East region, actually are, that they all have criminal records. I've heard some accounts of really local citizens there saying pretty horrible things about what they think these refugees are capable of, the crimes they're capable of committing. Where are the government efforts to educate people, to show them, to introduce them to these newcomers and to say, hey, we're all actually the same. We've faced the same trials in the past. Let's open our arms and welcome.
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure that there's that kind of cosmopolitanism here. I mean, there's just not. I mean, Koreans are very nationalistic, and the Korean sense of national identity is tied up with race and genetics. It's getting better. Korea does have more foreigners now than ever before. The foreigner population in Korea is something like 4% now. You do have mixed race children. My own children are mixed race and go to Korean schools and things like that. So it's getting better. But again, a lot of that is limited to states that Koreans have some exposure to and some experience with. You know, think about television, right? I mean, they see a lot of American movies. They learn English. They go to the United States for school. They're accustomed to Westerners. They have some vague sense of it. You know, they see the Eiffel Tower in the movies and things like that, right? Or, you know, people travel in the region, right? They get on a plane and they go to China or Japan or something like that. Again, the Middle East, though, is really far away for a lot of Koreans. So not just geographically, but psychologically, right? Places like India, Latin America. Koreans just are not exposed to that. And I mean, you could argue that the Korean education system needs to be improved in that direction. I'm actually comfortable making that argument. I do think that Koreans need to spend a little bit more effort on developing states. This is something I see in my own field in political science, where Koreans just don't really show a great deal of interest in the developing world, I would argue. But I mean, that's a huge national debate, and it's going to take a long time to get there, right? I mean, hopefully the backlash to this Korean explosion of hysteria over so few people will actually move some Korean minds, right? I mean, it has, you know, your program and, you know, in the American media has actually gotten wind of the fact that the Koreans have really kind of lost their minds over just 500 people, right? And hopefully there'll be something of a pushback by Korea's international partners to say, you know, wow, you have to sort of think about this stuff. You can't have these sort of racist explosions over 500 people who are fleeing a war zone.
Okay, let's hope so. Professor Kelly, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there as we're completely out of time for this segment. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us from South Korea. Well, that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, is the media the enemy of the American people? Or does Donald Trump's attack on the press endanger the lives of journalists? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.